1963. By all accounts, from those who were there, it was a pretty mild day in Washington, D.C. There were about 250,000 people who had gathered in our nation's capital to hear a series of speakers, most notably Martin Luther King, who would talk about freedom and equality. I'm not the first person to say that this was a great speech or a speech that inspired and touched millions of people. There are thousands of others who have studied it before me, and will probably be hundreds of thousands who study it after me. However, I might be one of the few who looks at it from a slightly different perspective. I think we would all agree that it is one of the most influential speeches in history, and still stands to this day as something that people continue to study and analyze. And I do as well, because I've been teaching communication and public speaking now for almost 20 years. But when I look at this speech and all of the events that took place, one of the things that I look at is, why did it influence people so much? And what I found is that there are about 5 different things that have led this particular speech to become so influential. Number 1, the first thing is the unity. When you hear the speech, it's almost impossible to not feel that sense of community, that sense of wanting to participate, and that feeling of wanting to be involved and do something to make a difference. Second, it set the tone. It set the tone for a peaceful revolution. And that was something that Martin Luther King was really focused on, was trying to make change through peace. And it was that particular speech that really inspired the nation. Third, the language. And there's no question that the words and the references to the Bible and to the Constitution have made it something that, to this day, stands the test of time of being some of the most powerful prose in the history of prose. Certainly there was a vision to the speech. And number 4, it was something that really created in the mind's eye a picture of how bright the future could look. And even today, when I show that video to students, they tend to look at it with inspiration in their eyes. And finally, number 5, it was without a doubt a speech that made people think. And when we watched the speech, we saw Martin Luther King, who was a very thoughtful man on stage. But to this day, it's something that makes people think. I look at it from those 5 perspectives because, although at the time, Martin Luther King and those who helped him write the speech didn't know it, we now understand that that is related to the way our brains work. You see, communication is not just a skill. In other words, it's not just something that we learn to do. Communication is something that our brains are programmed to do from before birth. And the way that we communicate isn't just something that we learn, but it's something that we're born with. And this is a slightly revolutionary idea, because after all, we tend to think of communication as just a skill. You take a public speaking class, you learn how to speak. You take a small group communication class, you learn how to work in groups. But the reality is that we all come into this world with our own unique ways of interacting. And I think everybody would agree that that's true. That's not revolutionary. But to make the argument then that the way you communicate is the result of the way your brain is wired is a little bit different. So I want to talk about that for a second. Let me give you the first example, the fear of speaking. It might not surprise you that many would say that this is one of the biggest fears of all humans, not just Americans, but of all humans. There was one study that was done in the late 70s. It wasn't the world's greatest study, but basically it came up with the list of people's fears, and it said that public speaking was people's number 1 fears, meeting the in-laws was behind that, snakes was behind that, even death was somewhere behind public speaking. Okay, so regardless of whether or not that's good research, it is true that a lot of people are scared by it. So here's what's interesting. If communication were a skill, we could get rid of the fear of public speaking just by training people how to give better speeches. The problem is that when researchers studied that, they found that even when people practiced giving speeches, they didn't become less fearful of it. Granted, they did get better at giving speeches, but they didn't get rid of the fear, because being afraid of speaking is something that's going on inside our brain. And it's actually pretty normal for us to be afraid of giving a speech. In fact, if you really think about it, standing up in front of people and being judged and listened to and sometimes even criticized isn't a natural human phenomenon. I mean, if we want to get along with people, we should just keep our mouth shut and go with the flow. So it's kind of natural for us to fear it. Another research study that was really interesting at the University of Missouri looked at twins. And what they did is they compared identical twins and fraternal twins and looked at how they communicated. So we have on one hand these identical twins who are genetically the same. And then we have these other fraternal twins who are not genetically the same, they're just like any other pair of siblings. And when they studied the way that they communicate, they found that the identical twins communicated the same on a number of measures about 70 to 90% of the time. The fraternal twins, just like any other siblings, communicated the same about 50% of the time. It was the same as any other siblings. And so what that tells us is that the way that we communicate has as much to do with our genetic makeup or our brain as it does with the way that we were raised. In fact, probably more to do with our genetic makeup. And we now understand this a little bit better because we've gone past the idea of saying that communication, or really that our brain, is divided into these two parts. So there was a time where it was kind of very common to just look at your brain as left and right. And the idea was the left side of your brain is the logical side. It's where our language is situated. The right side of our brain is the creative side, and that's where all of our creative thinking is situated. But unfortunately, that oversimplifies our brain to say that it's just divided into two parts. And now, thanks to newer technology, where we can actually look inside of people's brains using fMRIs, we can look at it much more advanced. Has anyone ever been in an fMRI? Isn't it fun? So I study brains, and I try to convince people to go into fMRIs. And you'd be surprised how many people don't want to volunteer to do that. I think it would be fun. So here's what we can do. We can put somebody into this, and we can have them, for example, watch a speech like Martin Luther King's speech, I Have a Dream, and we can see on pictures how that affects their brain. In other words, how their brain is processing and responding to messages. And it's kind of interesting that, number one, it's not just as simple as a left and a right side, but number two is that we have a lot of different parts of our brain that are involved in how we communicate, speak, listen, and interact with other people. So let me take just a minute to explain these different areas of the brain, and then I want to connect it to how do we communicate and what are some of the different ways that people actually speak and interact. So we'll just very briefly go through this. So we have this frontal lobe of our brain, this part in the front of our brain. Sometimes it's been called the social brain, because one of the things that that seems to do is give us the ability to look at other people and to make sense of how they're thinking and how they're acting and what they're doing towards us. It is this part of our brain that tells you if you come home, that were your life. Now, we have another part of our brain called the parietal lobe, up towards the top and on the side. And again, I'm just going to simplify this a little bit because I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to talk about some of the main things that these areas of the brain do. So our parietal lobe is sometimes called our spatial brain, and one of the things that it really functions to do is to give us this ability to make sense of the space and the world around us. And it's this part of our brain that's looking at this two-dimensional picture and seeing how this staircase, modeled after the Penrose staircase, seems to be never-ending. Now, in a 3D world, that would be impossible to do, but when we look at it, it makes perfect sense in our mind. Oh, look, you can go up the stairs and you'll never get to the top. The third part of our brain is this temporal lobe down here, which is often thought of as our language or linguistic brain. It's the part of our brain that connects speaking and listening to words. The fourth in the back is our occipital lobe, which is connected to our vision. So we've got this part in the back of our brain, ironically, which connects to our eyes and lets us make sense of the visual world. And it's through our eyes that we, in a sense, process information, but it's really through our brain that we actually make sense of that. And this is the reason that we're able to look at a map and then actually apply that to going out somewhere. Because we can visualize in our mind what the real world looks like. And then I've kind of combined this third part, or this fifth part rather, of our brain, this the brainstem, the internal brain, the limbic system, the cerebellum, all this deep part of our brain into one category. Sometimes it's called the old brain, sometimes it's called the reptile brain. And what it is it's the part of our brain that, among other things, has that fight or flight sense to it. And it's when you're walking through Los Padres National Forest and you see a mountain lion looking at you, that you think to yourself instantly, I have two choices. I can run, or I can try to fight this mountain lion. Hopefully you run, by the way. So, I volunteer with the Los Padres Forest, and I have, in my life, I've never seen a mountain lion. Has anyone ever seen a mountain lion? Has anyone seen a mountain lion in the forest? Okay. Has anyone seen a mountain lion in your backyard or in your garbage can? That's where everybody keeps seeing them. Walk by right by the house. I go out to the forest all day long looking for mountain lions, and they're in our backyards walking by our houses. But anyway, what I'm interested in is not so much just the part of the brain, but how does it connect to the other parts. Okay, so now that I've summarized it, I want to emphasize this, that our brain is not just divided into these four parts where we have the one part that is the language center. The reality is that they're all working together. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the ways that these influence how people communicate. So there really isn't a language center of the brain. It's important that we look at all of it. Cognitive communication is my theory that says that the way that we communicate is a result of each of these different areas of the brain having some sort of dominance, some sort of influence. And we use all parts of our brain to communicate as just one part. But I wanted to show you how this affects the way that we interact. So we'll start off with that front social part again. The social part of the brain leads people who are dominant in that to be what I call social communicators. Social communicators are really focused on how other people in a group feel and whether or not people are getting along. A good example of a social communicator was Lucille Ball, and I didn't obviously know her personally, so I'm just talking about more the public figure of Lucille Ball. But she was actually said to have been fairly shy as a young child and then kind of came out of her shell and loved to perform for her family and her parents' friends when they would come over. And she was also said to have been very comfortable in a room full of Hollywood executives, even though she was the only woman in the room. Didn't really face her. People who are social communicators tend to like social games, so they enjoy playing anything from charades with a group of people, or even now people who play games on their phone. They like to play those games where they're playing against someone else rather than just by themselves. And by the way, tell me if you see any of yourselves in any of these here, or other people that you know. Number two, the contextual communicator. A contextual communicator is somebody who's really focused on the context of where the communication is taking place and what's being said. And this kind of goes back to something that an anthropologist in the late 70s, 1976, came up with. He came up with this idea that cultures have levels of context. There are high context and low context cultures. A high context culture is a group or culture that just focuses on the situation. They don't really like to say things directly. A low context culture is a group that focuses on the language, not so much the situation. So they don't like to leave things unsaid. So I had a friend when we graduated from college who went to Japan and started teaching English in Japan. And the first time that he came home, a couple of friends of his said, oh, when you go back to California, can you get us some wine? Because apparently wine was very popular in Japan, especially the California wines. So he comes back with a couple bottles of wine for friends, and then everybody else says, oh, next time you go, I want some California wines too, bring them for me. So it occurs to him he has a business idea. So he starts a business where he's exporting wines to Japan, primarily California wines, and then selling them. And he gets a deal with a supermarket chain in Japan. And they take him out one day, and they're interested in doing business with him. And they ended up spending an entire day with him. And so they picked him up from his hotel, they took him out to lunch, they took him to the corporate offices, they took him to the supermarkets where they were going to sell the wine. They actually showed him the storage facility because they wanted him to know that they were not going to ruin any of the wine. They were going to keep it at the perfect temperature. And then they took him out to dinner, and then they took him back to the hotel. And as they were saying their goodbyes and bowing to each other, they said, tomorrow we know you have to leave, so we want to take you back to the airport. We don't want you to take a taxi. And my friend said to himself, yes, we're going to make a deal. Because that was all it took in that particular culture to say that we like you enough to do business with you. And so that's an example of a culture that doesn't specifically say, let's get down to business, let's talk numbers, let's make a deal. They just leave it to the situation. Now, I think Americans are much more low context. We do like to be direct and to the point. We don't like to leave things to the situation. And I think that Joan Rivers is a great example of that. I mean, after all, Joan Rivers could say some things that were direct and to the point and get away with it like no one else could. Remember after she passed away, they tried to keep her TV show going? And one of the hosts made a comment that was the same thing Joan Rivers would have said any day of the week on that show about how somebody was dressed. And that person came back and it pretty much ended the show. Because the only one who can get away with that was Joan Rivers. Now, I'm not a big fan of that American Idol show, but the guy Simon Cowell once said, if you had lived 2,000 years ago or something like that, I think they would have stoned you. So, a little direct. Yeah, so I don't think you're going to win this show. All right, number 3, linguistic. Now, obviously, when we think about communication, our first thought tends to go to words and language. But you have to remember that I, as a communication scholar, don't just look at language. I want to look at everything, nonverbal communication, situation, everything that relates to it. So this part of the brain influences our focus on language. Here is a wife who sent this to her husband. Her husband is a very linguistic person. Honey, we put some pasta on the stove for dinner tonight. Thanks, love you. And here's what she found when she came home. This is somebody who's very literal and what I call very linguistic. People who are, George Carlin was another great example. So George Carlin, who I think probably the only comedian who can say that his comedy routine sparked a Supreme Court case on free speech. He once said, I like words. He was very, I mean, the things that he could do with words were just incredible. People who are linguistic often love crossword puzzles because they love words and language. Number 4 are visual communicators. A visual communicator is very focused on on what they see. So if you've ever said, do you see what I'm saying, or do you see what I mean? You might be a visual communicator. By the way, if you say that to a linguistic person, they will actually look at you and say, no, I do not see what you say, although I hear what you're saying. So visual communicators, I think Robin Williams would have been high on this. He was somebody who was very visual, very animated. There's a researcher at the University of Arizona, Temple Grandin, who was born with autism, who is very, very highly visual. She, in her book, said, people have told me that they do not get lost with my directions, because the way that she thinks is basically in pictures. That's her book, in pictures. I'm a pretty visual person, and when I was in college, I took an English class where we had to read Shakespeare, and I just couldn't get anything out of reading Shakespeare. Then it occurred to me I could go down to the library and check out videos of the plays, and then I could read it while I was watching the play, and it made perfect sense. I completely got it, but I really struggled reading Shakespeare. It's always hard to read. And then people who are visual love visual games like puzzles and things. Our last, and the arts. Our last one that I'm just going to quickly go through is our cerebral communicators. Cerebral communicators are what I like to call the deep thinkers. They may not talk a lot, but they do think a lot, and then when they do speak out, they have something brilliant to say. So in a group, people will look at them and say, they're so quiet. And then when they speak, everybody just looks at them and says, wow. These are our deep thinkers. You know, Albert Einstein was reportedly, I can't find how true it is, but somewhere between, depending on what you read, says that he didn't start speaking until either the age of 2, some things say as late as 5. But either way, everybody agrees he was a late talker. And so when he was young, people thought that that there was something wrong with him because he didn't speak. And then the joke about Einstein is that when he finally did speak, somebody asked him, well, why did you wait so long to speak? And he said, I didn't have anything to say till now. A great thinker. People who are cerebral love cerebral games. Oftentimes they love games like chess or Sudoku. All right, so I'm going to skip this and I'm going to give you an example. So let me try to put it all together and then I'll leave you with a couple of thoughts on how does this relate to our lives. So I'll start off with directions. Let's say that you're driving down the road one day and you find yourself lost and you decide that you've got to ask somebody for directions. Now this could be the longest day of your life if you get the wrong person. If you pull up, by the way, if you're not visual and you pull up to a visual person and then ask them for directions, this will be a challenge. So you pull up, oh, excuse me, can you tell me how to get to the Santa Maria Inn from where I am? Well, the visual person who can see the way to get there is describing it as if you're looking at the drive. So they'll say, oh, sure. It's really easy. What you're going to do is you're going to go down this big road that you're on right here. You're just going to keep going. Oh, there's a taco place that you're going to pass. You'll pass the library. What else are you going to pass? Oh, you're going to pass the train tracks. And then Spearmint Rhino, and the library. And then it's right across from this really beautiful old building. I think it's white. It's got a really big tree in front of it. You can't miss it, big tree. And then you'll see the Santa Maria Inn. It'll be on this side of you. Old probably. I mean, there's a sign. There's a waterfall in front. You'll see it. So yeah, so that's how you get there. And now you're thinking to yourself, okay. And if you're not a visual person, that can be a little bit annoying. Now, if you get the linguistic person, who's very literal and direct, they're going to say to you, sure, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go south on Broadway. And you're going to follow Broadway for about 1 8.5 of a mile. And then when you cross the train tracks, about another 2.7 of a mile, and then you'll see it on your right. And I believe it's 1,000 more. Now here's the problem. I don't know if you've ever noticed this because I didn't grow up in Santa Maria, but when I'm driving south on Broadway, my compass on my car does not say south. It's very confusing. And when I'm driving south and I look at the ocean, what I think is south on the 101, and I look at the ocean, and I look at my compass on my car, it says south is straight out to the ocean. You ever noticed this before? This is very confusing for tourists.
The coast runs east and west.
Yeah, it's confusing for us. So if you tell them, and then in LA they figured it out. So in LA they say go west on the 405 freeway, which is kind of strange because then that makes sense. But the problem is that the 405, if you really think about it, kind of runs more south. But if you were looking at your compass, it says west. So there's our linguistic. Now our social person who's concerned with you says, you know what, it's not that far out of my way, I'm actually going up to San Francisco, but just follow me, I'll drive. Your cerebral person is in deep thought and says, oh, yes, you are going to want to go and by then you just get annoyed and drive away. And then our contextual person says, you're going to the Santa Maria Inn. The Radisson's nicer. Let's stay there. Okay, so I want to end with this thought. And since I didn't have a lot of time, I won't go through a whole training program on what you can do. But if you think about it and think of this as the idea that we are all different and remember it that way, then the next time that you're in a situation with somebody who's thinking a little bit different than you, doesn't see the world the way you see it, think of it as speaking to the different parts of their brain. So if you're a visual person and you've got somebody who's not visual, just remember that no matter how much you start telling them what to look for, they're not going to see it. Number one, speak to our brains. Number two, no surprise, I think we should appreciate our differences because after all, that is how we're wired. And I think that the great thing about having these differences is that when we get together, we're able to do things that are much greater than what we're doing separately. So if you're putting together a fundraising event and you've got people who are visual and linguistic and social, then you're really going to appeal to everybody who's going to be coming to the event. Even if people annoy you, we have this responsibility to try to adapt to them and not expect them to adapt to us. Because if you think about it, asking someone to adapt to you, that is to speak your way, is really asking them to change their brain. And that's probably not. And then finally, I want to just say thank you for, because there might be some linguistic people in the audience, thank you for having me here today and giving me an opportunity to share some of these thoughts. If you'd like some more information, I'd love to hang out and chat with you. And if you think anybody else would be interested in this, please feel free to grab my business card and pass it along.
Does anybody have questions?